Our final profile piece will take us a giant leap forward in time to what is undoubtedly one of the most infamous anti-Semitic works known. It's by someone who is otherwise a respected name, but in this instance that respect takes a serious nosedive. Martin Luther's The Jews and Their Lies is perhaps the most notorious of the historic church's anti-Semitic productions. It was reckoned an inspiration for Nazi persecution and execution of Jews, and so its shadow hangs over the 20th century and even to this day inspires anti-Semites. There is much in Luther's work here to be ashamed of, but did he use New Testament texts to accuse Jews of being Christ killers? As it happens, despite the nature of his attacks, Luther said remarkably little about Jewish responsibility for the death of Jesus. Much of what he said was directed towards the alleged immoral behavior of Jews of his day, which in turn he associated with the behavior of Jews in the biblical period. Luther was obviously keen to establish a sort of corporate responsibility of the type we discussed earlier, but his effort was clearly a failure. His charge of pride and ancestry sounds a little suspicious. We can hardly doubt that Jewish persons in the Europe of Luther's day found themselves in a situation much like that of Judeans and Christians in the Roman Empire, surrounded by temptations and opposition that sought to weaken their community bonds. What Luther took to be pride was probably more like protection. Further, it was arguably men like Luther who unwittingly enabled the protective self-cloistering which he misapprehended as pride. Luther's logic here also led to an obvious problem. The prophets themselves were Judeans, so how can he condemn Jews as a whole? It's a puzzle much like those who argue that the New Testament, having been written by Jews as a whole, offers anti-Semitic teachings. Luther was ready with a contrived answer. Yet by this very admission, Luther undermines his entire premise. It is not, after all, the mere stakes of group association that is the problem. Rather, it is their alleged arrogance about these stakes. But how does Luther distinguish between the mere fact that one claims these stakes and arrogance about them? Nothing but Luther's own distaste and disappointment seems to offer a way to discern. What little Luther did say about Jewish responsibility for the death of Jesus is confined to a handful of remarks. Luther is rather vague about his specific target. In passages like these, he refers to a they, but does not clearly define who they are. If we compare his descriptions to the New Testament text, we find that they variably matches with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, Judeans living in the Roman Empire, and Judeans as a whole. When it came to Christian anti-Semitism, Necessity was often the mother of invention.